Hey, thank you for all of your blessings. And just thank you that in light of everything that is going on in the whole world, we have it really, 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 really good. And Father, I just pray that we would appreciate it and not let that insulate us from reality, but appreciate the blessings that you've given us. And we pray that today, through the work of your Spirit, we would all leave here being more like your Son. And we pray these things in his name and for his sake always. Amen. All right. So, last 2 weeks ago, I don't even remember. Last time we talked, I contrasted the contemporary philosophy of the human being at the time that was laid out by Plato and became the basis for modern Western philosophy, and that you have this distinction between the body, the soul, and the rational soul, and kind of how all that worked. And then we looked at the Old Testament view that the Bible takes of the heart, the nephesh, and the meod, which I have been referring to as the muchness, and talked about how they're very different ways of approaching this. And the ancient Hebraic people had a holistic view of creation and the body and the spirit and all that kind of stuff, whereas the Western side had a very dichotomous or trichotomous view, depending on how you argue the whole thing down the line. So what we're going to do today is I do want to show you that Paul is definitely over here in the way that he talks about these things. But then I want to also answer the question, okay, but then, so what about the Spirit? Because over here, like when we read the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, there was no mention of Spirit, but the word Spirit is used throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And what is going on and how does all of this work? So, we're going to pick this up in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Because, again, it's easy to kind of miss some of this stuff because of the English words that we choose to translate things. Okay, so in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is addressing, like, the main issue is that there's people at Corinth who are saying that there is no resurrection. People that study this stuff propose that the reason why some people at Corinth are saying there's no resurrection is because they believe that, or that they're saying that basically they've already attained spiritual perfection because they're able to speak in the tongues of angels. And so there's nothing more for them, so there must not be a resurrection in the future because they've already arrived. And so Paul is going to be going into a defense of the resurrection, and he roots it within the core idea of the gospel at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so he lays that out. He lays out his core teaching of the gospel in the first two paragraphs. And then in 12 it says, now if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, because that's part of his gospel, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? And so now he's going to address this specific concern. And he's going to go through, and Paul, he does this in several of his letters when he is writing in this dialectic fashion, where he anticipates questions that people might have or objections that they might bring up. Because, he's not there teaching. He's writing this letter. So he's trying to future-proof a little bit. And there's going to be a discussion about the kind of body that people will have once they're resurrected. And the idea is that some people are saying, look, there's not going to be a resurrection. And they're trying to make it sound like having a body when you're resurrected is a silly thing. So, of course, there's no resurrection. So Paul addresses this in 1 Corinthians 15:35. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? You foolish person. So, again, and so he's doing a little thing kind of like what Jesus did, where someone's trying to make what like these guys are trying to make Paul's belief in the resurrection look foolish, and Paul's like, no, you guys are the foolish people. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies, and what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. And so he starts with this agrarian example, and he's saying, like, look how God orders creation with plants. You have a seed, you plant the seed. In the ancient times, this was often associated with death because you buried the seed. Okay, but then life comes out of it. There's a plant. The plant looks different than the seed. And then he takes it into the animal kingdom. Verse 39, for not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. And so, like, he's recognizing, like, in the animal kingdom, there's all kinds of different bodies. This is not a problem. Verse 40, there are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another. And it's easy to kind of run past, but again, when you look at the Old Testament, every time an angelic being or an Elohim shows up, they have a body. And so he's saying, look, you guys know that there's heavenly beings that have bodies that are different than us earthly folk. Verse 41, there's one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for the stars differ from star in glory. So he gives these three examples from creation of things having different bodies. And specifically with the plants, there's a resurrection theme in there. The body that the seed has before it dies is different than the plant has after it has grown. And so he says in verse 42, so is it with the resurrection of the dead. So in all these other aspects of creation, this is the way different bodies work. And he's saying it's going to work the same way with the resurrection. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, and it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. And so part of what's going on is this is part of the contrast that Paul has been making through the whole book. Like, you can go all the way back to chapter 1 and 2, and like when Paul says the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they're spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things. These are the same words that Paul's using here. He's been doing this natural spirit thing throughout the whole book to try to kind of kidney bunch the Corinthians and their view of spirituality. And so he's doing it here. And so for Paul, there is a natural body, and then there is a spiritual body that is a physical body. But it's incorruptible and imperishable. So Plato would have lost his mind in this discussion. Because spirit and body are completely separate. Spirit is good, body is bad. We want to get rid of body. You don't have spiritual bodies. And spiritual things aren't physical. They're not manifest in creation. And then Paul keeps going, and he says in verse 45, thus it is written, and he's going to quote Genesis, the first man became a living being. And if you have a footnote there, it's literally in the Greek a living soul. And it's quoting from Genesis chapter 2, where it says that God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and he became a nephesh. That word that means a living being, the entirety of a being. It's the Old Testament word that gets translated with the English word soul. So again, it's not this component piece. It's not the rational soul that Plato was talking about, but it's a living being. It's something that you are. And then he attaches this with the phrase, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. A spirit is something that you are. It's related to the whole being. It's not this, again, component piece. Plato would just lose it in this discussion with Paul, because he's using this language in a way that is foreign to that contemporary Greek philosophy, but it's very, very comfortable with Paul's natural worldview as a faithful Jew and growing up and believing the Old Testament. Okay, so this is the way that we're approaching this whole discussion, not this way. Now, with that being said, well, okay, so what about the Spirit? Because the Bible talks about the Spirit and the human spirit a lot. And so, this is the question that I would like to address. And I would like to do this by, again, jumping into the Old Testament and looking at the Old Testament usage and assumptions about the Spirit. Okay, so we're going to dig into some Hebrew, and we're going to look at some passages. This is not going to be an exhaustive word study. You can do that. But I'm going to try to give kind of a survey of the usage and the understanding. So, our discussion is, there's going to be two words that are central to this whole idea. And they are ruah and nahasama. There's a rough breathing mark in there, and I don't really know how to pronounce it well. But these two words are going to be the core of our discussion. And in their primary usage, they're going to be wind and breath, respectively. But that, there's going to be more to it than that, and we're going to kind of discuss it. So, here's the idea. Within this particular case, the words are kind of used interchangeable because the nasama is a ruha, but not all ruha are nasama. It's kind of like all insects are bugs, but not all bugs are insects. And the kind of the way that the word sits within the understanding of the language is, so you're outside and you're looking around, and you can look at a tree, and again, within that worldview, they understood that there was a difference between like plant life, vegetable life, and like animal life. That plant life was not a nefesh, but you can see the trees moving. And that's something that animals do, that's something people do. You look up in the sky, you see the clouds, you can see the clouds moving. But you know the clouds aren't nefesh. They're not alive like animals are and like people's are. So there's something that is animating or providing the ability to move, emotion, some sort of dynamic existence to the trees, to the clouds. Okay, we all know what that is. That's the wind. All right, and that's ruah. Now, within that worldview, within that philosophy, there was a recognition that in the same way that there's something that animates the clouds and that animates the winds, there's something that animates me. And in the same way that I cannot see that which animates the trees and animates the clouds, I can't see that which animates me. But since it is an invisible thing that animates, it's a ruah. It's not the same thing as the wind, but we take a step back, and anything that you cannot see, but that you can interact with, and that provides some sort of animating force, is going to be a ruah. So the wind is a ruah because you can't see it, but it moves the trees, it moves the clouds. There's something in me that animates me that you can't see. And it's more than just like an animation of like movement, but it's kind of, trying to find English words to describe it is difficult, but it's almost kind of like an animation of passion. Like that thing that gets you up out of bed in the morning, and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this, whatever it is. That's ruah. And so in its usage within the Old Testament, it's going to be connected to a lot of emotional stuff. And we'll see this kind of as we walk it out. All right. So I want to build this connection that we have between ruah and nahasama. And we're just going to start in Genesis. And I'm just kind of, I don't know. I'm not great at walking through word studies, so we're going to do the best thing that we can. All right, so some examples of this. So Genesis 2:7. I should have done this point before I started going on about meaning, but my notes are a mess. Genesis 2:7, this is a verse that many of us would be familiar with. So then the Lord God formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a nephesh. And so at Genesis 2:7, this is the nasama of life. But then when we go to Genesis 6:17, and so this is leading up to, this is within the flood account. Did I say 6:17? I think I meant 7:17. Or is it 6? We'll find out. Yeah, it's 6. Yeah, you're right. For behold, I will bring a flood of the waters on the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. That is the ruah of life. And then 722 is a fun one, if you like this stuff. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. In this one, it has nasama and ruah. And I think the King James, trying to communicate this, it actually translates it in everything that had the spirit of the breath of life. And so it uses both words in the same context to communicate this idea. So again, both of these words of ruah and nasama are used interchangeably when we're talking about this thing that is the breath of life that God breathed into Adam that made him a nephesh. And that characterizes, this is why you are a nephesh, because the ruah of life or the nasama of life is in you. All right, now another kind of set of texts that I think kind of lays out in large part the Old Testament usage of this is in the book of Job. And these ones are also fun because it's in poetic form. And so we can go back in Old Testament survey, when we looked at the poetic literature and we looked at like Hebrew parallelism and all that kind of stuff, that kind of comes into play to help us understand what's going on here. Maybe understand. We'll see what happens. We're going to start in Job 27. And it's Job 27:3. And this is where we're getting into, Job has been going back and forth with his friends. This is before the younger guy jumps in defense of God, because this comes slightly before Job accuses God of wronging him unjustly. Okay, so Verse 1, and Job again took up his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my nephesh bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. So we get this parallel phrase, as long as my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. And so the language in here, it's my ruah is in me, and the nasama of God is in my nostrils. And he's using this idea of parallelism, and that nahasam, I'm going to pronounce that like a million different times throughout this whole discussion, of God in my nostrils, that's a direct allusion back to Genesis chapter 2, where God breathing the breath of life into Adam's nostrils. And so he's saying, okay, my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. So then things are going to go for a little while. And then when we get to 32, this is with Elihu is now responding. I'll start in verse 6. The key verse is in 8, and it's 8, yeah. So I guess start in verse 6. And Elihu, the son of that other guy, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. This is wonderfully culturally appropriate. You're supposed to let the older, wiser people talk, and if you're younger, you're supposed to listen. And so he's saying, like, I'm going to let those older and wiser than me. Verse 8, but it is the Spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged to understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion. He's saying, I might be young, but it's not age that brings wisdom. It is the Spirit of man, the breath of the Almighty. And so what was implied back here, that Job's breath, Job's spirit, the breath of God were the same thing. I can't pronounce this guy's name. It just comes right out and says it. But in this case, it is the... did I do this? Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. My notes are a mess. I screwed this up. In 27:3, it was my Nasama, the Ruah of God. In 32:8, he's saying, my Ruah, the Nasama of God. He flipped it than what Job said. So Job says, it's my breath, it's the Spirit of God in my nostrils, but this younger guy is saying, it's my spirit, which is the breath of God. All right, let me grab this. I apologize. There you go.
Okay, so, yeah. Because my brain is sciencey. So is the Ruah, is that kind of like the animating life force of everything that can physically move by itself, but then the Nasama is like the special thing that makes us different as being, like, because like something like, animals are alive, they breathe and move like us,
Yeah.
but we're the only ones that God actually breathed life into. Is that the basic difference?
So, no, God breathed life into animals too. It says that animals have the breath of life.
Well, like what I meant was God actually came and breathed the life into Adam. Like he specifically.
Right, but I think that distinction, again, is a modern Western distinction. In the Old Testament, the same breath of life that we have is the same breath of life that animals have.
I don't like that.
Okay. It's okay. And here, Elihu specifically identifies that it is this ruah, this nasama, that enables us to have wisdom and understanding. Okay, that is why we experience that. That's the source of it. And so, because his argument is, wisdom and experience doesn't come from age, it comes from the Spirit. David makes a similar argument in Psalm 119 where he says, age doesn't give people wisdom, the law of the Lord gives people wisdom. All right, I'm going to walk the mic over to my wife.
I'm just thinking about Amanda's question, and I'm wondering, are people in the animal kingdom with the animals in the same way that God is a spirit, like all the other spirits, but God is not the same as them? He is so far above, in the same way like we are in God's image. So we are over the animals, even though we are like them, just like God is a spirit, and He is over all the other spirits. He's different.
So, again, I want to be careful because the Linnaeus's organization of taxonomy is a modern Western invention that we use to be able to organize living things, and it's primarily based on who can have babies with who. And it's just one way of organizing creation. The Old Testament way of organizing creation is you have stuff that it's just about reproduction. So plants, fish, most lizards and amphibians, like that, they're just this physical part of creation. Then you have nephesh, which have the breath of life, that are capable of mutual, reciprocal social relationship. And this is where like the idea of like animals are people too actually has more biblical foundation than other stuff. They're nephesh. They are nephesh. So I guess I don't want to use the word people. I want to use the word nephesh. Okay, and so they're part of this creation, that just like we are, and they're capable of reciprocal, meaningful, emotional relationships with each other, just like we are, and we are with them. And we have a responsibility in our role of creation to properly shepherd and take care and bring under submission and all that kind of stuff. But then there's also this uniqueness within human beings that we are made in the image of God. I can have a relationship with my cat. My cat has a relationship with me. My cat can't have a relationship with God. But I can have a relationship with God. And God has a relationship with me. And that is this distinctive point. In fact, the whole idea of creation is God, like if you look back at Genesis 1, God creates everything. He brings everything into order. But the part that He doesn't bring into order are the nephesh creatures. He tells humanity, okay, now you need to go out and bring creation under submission, and you need to bring it into this created order. And so in the same way that I created all this stuff, and then brought it into order. You now, as my image, which again, that word for image, everywhere else in the Old Testament, that's translated as idol. Like it is the word for representation of a deity. Now you need to go out and you need to take all these nefesh creatures and bring them into this creative order. And so like part of that creation mandate, God is saying, what I did with the universe, you're going to do with nefesh creation. And we're going to talk about this when we get into angelology. Humanity, as being created in the image of God, we're supposed to be part of the Elohim, that group of heavenly beings that are part of the heavenly court and are in fellowship with God. But because we fell, we're not. And the big part of redemptive history in the Old Testament is us being restored to the heavenly court. And there's a huge amount of imagery. So humanity, because of the fall, we're kind of in this like 1 foot in, 1 foot out situation. But that's characteristic of redemptive history, or we're supposed to be fixing this. So there is a way in which we share with animals, or most mammals and like large reptiles, because we are nefesh, but we're supposed to be Elohim. And we're supposed to be, our primary relationship is supposed to be with God. And that is very unscientific because, again, ancient Hebrew thought was very unscientific. So it doesn't fit into our modern Western categories very well, which is fine because the Bible doesn't care about that particular.
Two things.
Okay.
So when people like study, remains and all that stuff from long ago, when do they see signs of religion? Is that just with modern man? Did Neanderthals have religion?
That is a huge matter of discussion within the current discourse, whether or not Neanderthals and other hominids that aren't modern humans, whether or not they had religious practices. I'm not an expert, and I keep a little bit of an eye on the literature. I'm kind of waiting for them to figure it out, but I'm leaning a little bit more towards them having religion, being in the image of God. There's an interesting, I got to finish it, but there is a theory out there presented by William Lane Craig that Adam and Eve were not modern anatomical humans, but predated Neanderthals. But there's just a lot of, it's hard because the time period of overlap between Neanderthals and modern anatomical humans is within the blind zone of carbon dating. So it's really, really hard to date these artifacts and to be able to say 100%, oh yeah, these were made by Neanderthals or these were made by modern anatomical humans, because it's a hard little, but there's people out there that have jewelry making, cave painting, burial sites, that there's a lot of evidence that would suggest that these were Neanderthals, and all that stuff at that time had religious connotations. Oh my goodness. I don't know, maybe.
Well, I just have one last comment. So,
go ahead.
When I look at animals who have relationships with people, I see a similarity between like people who have relationship with God.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
like when you see
Yeah.
dogs that have like a really good tight bond with their owner,
Yeah.
like they can do amazing
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And when you see people just living their lives apart from God, and then you see someone who's like full of the Spirit of God, acting as Jesus would, it's a glorious thing.
No, this is something that fascinates me, because I've talked about this before. Do you guys remember the closest cognitive correlate within the animal kingdom to human beings? Ravens. Yeah, it's corvids, ravens and crows. In the lab situations, we have taught chimpanzees to use a tool to get food and to use a tool to get another tool to get food. But if to add a third level of complexity, they can't do it. Ravens can. Ravens can use a tool to get a third tool to get food, but only when trained by a human being. one of the guys that I still like him a lot. I used to read a lot of his stuff, whose name just flew out of my head. Hugh Ross. His dad had a pet raven. And he would lock the cage that the raven was in, not to keep it in, but so that the raven could pick the lock and be entertained. But there was a point at which the raven just wouldn't do it anymore. It would just sit in the cage. And so he switched out that lock for a more complicated lock. And then the raven started picking that. And he would have to periodically upgrade the lock because the raven would get bored and like, I'm not doing this anymore. Do you know the closest emotional cognate to human beings are? Yes, cetaceans, specifically killer whales, where they've done stuff, and this is why we don't separate killer whales from pods anymore to put them in amusement parks, because the studies have shown that killer whales actually feel emotions deeper than human beings do, and so they're much more likely to have like depression and stuff. And so if you take a baby from a mother killer whale, she'll commit suicide. This happened with a dolphin, actually, that had a very, very close relationship with a trainer, and they transferred the trainer away, and the dolphin drowned itself when it realized the trainer wasn't ever coming back. And there's a really, really interesting verse that, depending how you translate it, says that God made the great sea whales to play with. So there's really interesting stuff. And so again, the idea is, it's only in our relationship with God that human beings reach the full potential of who they can be. And that's mirrored within creation, that it's only in relationship with human beings that these other nefesh creatures can reach their full potential. But this is another, we get into the fall, through relationship with human beings can pass the consequences of the fall onto other nefesh creatures. And this is where you get that there's no such thing as a bad dog, there's just bad owners. And you look at, not in situations in the Old Testament where we talked about societal depravity, there's a point where not only does the society have to be removed, but the nefesh life that's associated with that society also has to be removed. And so like we can be the best thing that ever happened to creation, and we can also be the worst thing that ever happened to creation. But that's because of the way, again, we are created in the image of God. We are in the position of God over the nefesh creation. That's Genesis chapter 1. But we can either exercise that and be like God, or we can exercise that and be like the devil, who humanity joined in rebellion in Genesis chapter 3. And that's why Jesus says, you're of your father, the devil. And that gets passed down to these nefesh creatures that are underneath our kind of submission. I geek out about all this stuff. All right, go ahead.
So I'm very much into creationism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And to go along with what you said, Adam and Eve were not Homo sapiens.
There's people that are talking about
so,
that. Yeah.
Well, going from the secular meaning of Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
As, you know, one cat off the ark made all the cats we have now, humans, through evolution, changed. And the Homo erectus they have, like, you know, in like psychoscience, what they've named that.
Yeah.
That was like Abraham and Moses and all that. And then it slowly changed. And the Neanderthals were a branch that just didn't.
Yes, there is an idea that's being explored that we should stop patting ourselves on the head as being modern human, and that those ancient hominids actually were human. They had relationship with God. They were nefesh.
Yeah, they just looked different from us because
right.
They had different diet, different, all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were just as intelligent and spiritual and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, it's a whole thing. And again, there's lots of papers being written about it right now and research being done, and it's difficult because of it's hard to date this stuff. And I'm sure really interesting things will come out of it in 50 or 60 years, but ultimately I don't think it's really all that important. And as on, I don't know, we'll talk about it later. Okay, now, 34:14. Yeah. And this is back to Elihu. And this is in his defense against God. I think we give Elihu a bad rap sometimes because his whole thing was a defense of God, and God never rebuked him for any of it. 34:14, I already wrote this up here. Okay, if he, this is God, the Almighty, should set his heart to it and gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. And so this it's God's ruah and nahasama. I'm putting too much of a vowel sound on that rough breathing mark. It's just supposed to be and so we have this usage throughout this discussion where, like, it's my breath, it's God's spirit. It's my spirit, it's God's breath. It's God's spirit, and it's God's breath. And again, in this one, it's if God wanted to gather all of that back, if he wanted to take his spirit and his breath back, we would all die. Because that's the thing that's in us that's giving us life, that's animating us. And so the kind of the Old Testament perspective here is, okay, like the thing that's in me, the breath that's in me, the spirit, the ruah that's in me that animates me, that gives me life, that gives me passion, it's mine because it's in me. But it's also God's because it's from him, and it's going back to him when I die. And he can take it back whenever he wants. So the spirit that is in me was given to me by God. He can take it back whenever he wants. And it is that spirit, that breath that is in me, that gives me life, that gives me passion. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And that also, according to Hillel, that's where my capacity for wisdom and understanding and knowledge comes from. And this is kind of the core idea of what spirit, ruah, nasama means in the Old Testament. Okay, and we see this throughout both the Old Testament and allusions in the New Testament kind of work themselves out. You know, for example, this kind of dichotomy between like my spirit, God's spirit. One of the verses that, this is one that my father-in-law would always kind of discuss because I was trying to make it Greek, and now I know better. Psalm 20. Proverbs. Okay, whew, man, it's been a long week. Appreciate it. Proverbs 20, 27. Yeah, so the ESV translated the spirit of a man, that's nasama, the breath of a man, is the lamp of the Lord, searching all of his innermost parts. So again, it's the spirit of the man, but it's the lamp of the Lord. And this idea of like that, searching the innermost parts, it's connected to this, again, this idea of that's where like wisdom and understanding and all that stuff is. And it's alluded to in 1 Corinthians. And also alluded to in Romans 8, But in 1 Corinthians 2:10, or going back to 9, 1 Corinthians 2:9, but as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him, these things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God, for who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person which is in him? Well, why is it that the Spirit knows a person's thoughts? Because that's where the person's thoughts are. It alludes to it in Romans 8, where the Spirit is praying for us according to the will of God. We don't know what the will of God is. That's why we don't know what to pray. But the Spirit knows what the will of God is, because he's the Spirit of God. Okay, so it's the spirit of man, but it's the lamp of God. Although, I'll throw this up here in Romans 8:16. And this is the whole where his Spirit testifies with our spirit. So, like, the Spirit of God is distinct from our spirit. So the ruah we have from God, that is our life, that is our understanding, that's different than the ruah of God that is the Holy Spirit. So God has, there's kind of more than one ruah involved in here. And then for some reason, I put Genesis 6:3 in here because, again, I think this is an allusion to this whole idea. But kind of in the opposite, where in Romans, the Spirit of God is testifying with our spirit, but in Genesis 6, it says, my spirit shall not, and it's usually translated abide in man forever, but it's literally contend with. But again, the word has the idea of being there, being in. That's why they like abide with. So again, it's this idea of the ruah of God interacting with the ruah of man. Okay. So here's some of the other usage, like relating it to the idea of wisdom, understanding, and thinking. I'll throw some verses up here. 3, 31, 3, Psalms 32, 2. This is just, again, a sampling. Exodus 28, 3. This is God talking to Moses about putting the whole temple system together. So if I start in verse 1, then bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu and Eleazar and Ithamar, and you shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother, for glory and for beauty. You shall speak to all the skillful, who I have filled with a spirit of skill, that they make Aaron's garments to consecrate him for my priesthood. So the idea of having skill was associated with the Spirit. The same kind of idea over in 31 with Oholiab and Bezalel, who are going to make all the fancy furniture. So 31:3, I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship. So the idea of ability, intelligence, knowledge, all of this is associated with the Spirit in the Old Testament. Psalm 32, 2. And I like this one because it relates back to Job's statements. Because remember here, Job is like, okay, as long as my spirit is in me, the breath of God is in my nostrils, I'm not going to lie. And Psalms 32:2 also picks up this. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, in whose spirit there is no deceit. We lie and we deceive in our spirit. All right, I'll squeeze some of this next two things together because there is a strong association between the spirit and the heart. And this has to do with the idea of the disposition of the spirit. And this is one where, like, some people that really dig into this draw a really hard line, because technically, nobody's ever in the Old Testament feels with their spirit. You feel with your heart. But you have a disposition in your spirit. And I think as we look at examples, this will make more sense. But the Bible all the time is going to draw a correlation between the spirit and the heart. So there's a big relationship as to what is going on here. So for example, and this also gets into the idea of the heart animating, but more than just like physically animating, but also the idea of like passion. So Joshua 2:11. I'll put this one up here as kind of the theme, and then we'll go through them in order after that. Oh, that clock is broken. What time is it? Okay. All right. So this is Rahab talking to the spies. So I'll start in verse 8. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know the Lord has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, to Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. And so it says there, ruah, there was no ruah in them. And so, like, she's not saying they died. But when they heard of all the things that God did, now, like they lost their motivation. Like, we're doomed. There's nothing that we can do. We're going to be destroyed. God is going to judge us. And so the metaphor that was used is their spirit left them. There was none of it left inside of them. So they had no, anymore. So again, that's that idea of animating being more than just, like, physically moving stuff around. And there's going to be times, and I'll list one up here, where the word ruah is actually translated as anger on the opposite end, where it's like you're angry, so you're going to do something. Okay, so I'll put the verses up here in case we don't get to them all, but Genesis 26:35, 41:8, 45:27, Numbers 5:14, 14:24, Deuteronomy 2:30. It's a bunch of Judges. They're fun. 8:3, 15:19. Yeah, it's used a lot. Psalm 51, 10 through 17 comes up there a lot. 77:6, 143:4. This is just a sampling across its usage in the Old Testament in a metaphoric sense. So we'll do some of these Old Testament ones just so you can see the picture. A lot of these are familiar accounts. So Genesis 26:35. Several of these are going to be about Jacob. So this is when Ehud marries another woman, and it says they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Literally, they made Isaac and Rebekah bitter of spirit. So again, it's this disposition of bitterness. 41:8 is also going to be Jacob. See, I was looking in 40 and I was all confused. Am I missing a page in my Bible? There we go. This is the Pharaoh. He had his dreams. So in the morning, his spirit was troubled. And he had a troubled spirit. 45:27. I went to 47. My brain is fried. This is when they tell Jacob that Joseph is alive. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. So before this, when he thought Joseph was dead, it was like, there's nothing left for me. Now Joseph is alive. His spirit revives. And now he's back into it again. Numbers, same kind of stuff. 5:14. I think this is also part of the association between, we get some heart stuff in there. And if the spirit of jealousy comes over him and he is jealous of his wife, so again, the disposition of his spirit, and you can check out the rest of them. We'll go to Psalm 51. So you see it you see it in the New Testament. It's in a similar fashion, but you'd only kind of be like, oh yeah, that's what's going on here, as if you were familiar with it in the Old Testament, because we're just so attuned to hearing the word spirit and just think of like the ghost part of me. 51. My super. No, I got 2 minutes. I'm gonna use it. So this is the whole section here. So Psalm 51:10, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So again, we see both like the disposition of the spirit and that close association between the spirit and the heart. So you will see this all over the place. And I think kind of like if we really wanted to nail it down, the idea is like the heart feels, and that kind of creates the disposition of the spirit. And I guess what I'm trying to lay out here is the way that the Old Testament looks at this is very much the way that we would describe the function of the mind in our modern Western framework. Thinking, wisdom, skill, emotional, like we know emotional memories in your brain now, and all this kind of stuff. And so in the Old Testament perspective, it's the part of us that animates us to life, the part of us that animates our passion, the part of us that allows us to think and understand and have knowledge and skill, and the part of us that sets the disposition of the way we do all those things. That's all the Spirit. And it comes from God. It's His. But He gave it to us. He can take it back. It's going to go back to Him when we die. So how is that going to work out in this paragraph in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, where Paul is, if I'm saying that we should think of the Spirit the same way that we would normally think of the mind, why is Paul contrasting the Spirit and the mind in 1 Corinthians 14? That's what we're going to talk about next week, because he's not actually doing that. It's a bad translation. We're going to talk about it. Okay. I'm going to close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and your blessings. We thank you for your Spirit. We thank you for giving us life. And we thank you that when our spirit was broken, you took steps to restore us and bring us back into relationship with you, because that's what sets us apart from all of creation, Father. So, as David prayed that we would have a clean heart and a new spirit, Father, that you would do that same work in us. Amen.